In the quiet folds of Georgia's backcountry, an old black farmer named Elijah kept to himself. Widowed, childless, and grizzled by the years, he worked his land with the silence of someone long forgotten by the world. Most nights, he went to bed with the crickets. But on this night, something pulled him to the town market. The place buzzed with heat, cheap liquor, and loose talk. That's when he saw the commotion. A red-faced man, drunk and swaying, stood on a crate hollering about a burden he couldn't keep. At his side was a girl, no older than 12, dirty, barefoot, and wide-eyed. She didn't speak, didn't blink. Townsfolk murmured that she was deaf, maybe mute too. No one dared take her in, but Elijah stepped forward, silent as ever, and laid money down. Real money. The drunk spat and staggered away, leaving the girl standing beside Elijah like a ghost without a name. The crowd gawked. What would an old man want with a silent child? Charity? Madness? Elijah didn't answer, just tipped his hat and walked away with her into the night, and behind them, whispers rose like smoke. Elijah's farm sat at the edge of nowhere, just beyond the last gravel road, where the fields met the woods and silence ruled the land. His days were a rhythm of chores, milking the cow at dawn, feeding the chickens, tending rows of colored greens and corn. His only companions were the animals, the wind, and the low hum of cicadas. His house was a creaky old thing, more wood than paint now, filled with the quiet echoes of a life once shared. Years ago, his wife, Ruth, had filled the rooms with laughter and warmth. She died too young, a fever in the spring, and since then time had trickled by like water through a cracked jar. They'd never had children. That grief was quieter but deeper, like a root that never stopped growing. At night, Elijah would sit on the porch, a tin cup of sweet tea in hand, watching the stars. Sometimes he'd talk aloud, though no one was there to answer. He wasn't cruel, not by nature, but the world had closed in on him, and somewhere along the way he'd forgotten how to reach for people. So when he saw that girl at the market, alone, discarded, silent, something in him stirred. It wasn't pity, it was recognition, a knowing. She stood like a shadow he'd seen before, lost in plain sight. Paying for her wasn't a transaction, it was a rescue. For both of them, he didn't know if she was deaf, didn't even ask. All he saw was that she had no place, no voice, and no one willing to give her a chance. Elijah didn't need a child, but maybe he needed someone to hear the silence with him. And maybe, just maybe, she needed someone who wouldn't ask her to speak. So he brought her home, not as a possession, but as a question he hadn't yet found the answer to. She didn't have a name, not one she offered. When Elijah brought her to the farm, she stood in the doorway like a shadow that had followed him home. Her hair was tangled, her clothes stiff with dirt, and her bare feet were cracked and bruised. She didn't flinch, didn't cry, just stared, eyes too still for a child. Elijah tried to talk to her, soft and slow, the way you might approach a wounded animal. "You hungry, girl?" he asked, holding out a piece of cornbread. No answer, no movement, only silence. He set food on the table and stepped back. She eventually came forward and ate, quick, guarded bites, as if someone might take it away. She didn't speak, didn't react when the floor creaked or when he called from the porch. He even clapped once, loud and sharp. Nothing. Deaf, he thought. Mute, maybe. But more than that, she was scared. Not in the usual way, but like someone who had learned silence was the only safe place to live in. At night, she slept curled on a cot in the corner of the room, facing the wall. Elijah watched from his chair, unsure what to do with this quiet presence in his quiet life. He meant no harm. He only wanted to understand her, maybe even help her heal. But he didn't know how to reach a girl who didn't make a sound. Still, he left the door open every morning, left food. Sat nearby in case she ever decided to speak. Or not. She was a mystery, wrapped in dust and silence. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah realized he was afraid, not of her, but of getting it wrong. Elijah didn't ask for much, only that she be safe, fed, and warm. Each day he offered what little he had. He gave her clean clothes patched from old fabric. He cooked simple meals, grits, greens, cornbread, stews thick with beans. He never forced her to eat, only placed the food gently near her and stepped away. She always took it, not with thanks, but with quiet acceptance. He gave her a bed by the fire, soft with old quilts. She never smiled, never spoke. But when the wind howled at night, she didn't tremble like before. That was something. The days passed slowly, stitched together by routine. Elijah worked the fields, and she would sometimes follow. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Something passed between them in gestures and glances, the kind of understanding only loneliness teaches. Sometimes, while he fixed the fence or mended tools, she'd kneel in the dirt and draw. Not random scribbles, real pictures, a tree, a bird, a face. One day she drew two figures, a tall one and a small one standing under a sun. Elijah saw it and paused. She looked up, met his eyes for just a second, then erased it with her hand. He didn't press, just gave a slow nod and went back to work. She hadn't spoken, not once. But for the first time, Elijah felt like she had said something. The next morning, Elijah tried something different. He stood behind her as she crouched near the garden bed, sifting through weeds. "Girl," he said softly, then louder, "Hey, girl." No response. Later, while she fed the chickens, he whistled, low and tuneful, something his wife used to hum. The girl paused for a moment, then kept scattering the feed. Each time her reactions were small, a shift of the head, a slight pause, but never enough to say for sure. Elijah wasn't certain if she heard, or if she was just sensing movement, vibration, presence. The line between hearing and knowing was too thin to see clearly. He became more deliberate in his tests, closing doors louder than necessary, humming while he worked, dropping tools just to see. Sometimes she reacted, sometimes not, and that inconsistency only deepened the mystery. One afternoon, he called her again, gentle, patient, and when she didn't respond, he sighed and turned away. But when he looked back, he caught her watching him from the corner of her eye. Their gazes met. She looked down quickly, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. Her shoulders stiffened, her breathing quickened. Fear returned to her face, not of harm, but of being found out. Elijah realized what he'd done. His tests weren't gentle puzzles to her, they were traps. He wasn't angry, only more confused, but she didn't know that. She backed away that night, sleeping farther from the fire. The distance between them grew again, wordless and wide. Elijah lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering. The rain came hard that day, drumming on the tin roof in heavy waves. The girl stayed indoors, sitting quietly in the corner, while Elijah whittled wood by the fire. He'd been working on a small toy, a carved horse, rough but full of care. He left it on the table when he stepped outside to check the chicken coop. When he returned, the toy lay in pieces on the floor. The girl knelt beside it, eyes wide with panic, hands trembling. She'd knocked it over by accident, and the brittle leg had snapped clean off. Elijah paused in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat. She stared up at him, breath shallow, expecting something. A shout, a blow, rejection. But he didn't move toward her, just sighed softly and crouched to pick up the broken piece. "It's all right," he said, voice low and even. "It's just wood." She shook her head, backing away, her hands covering her mouth like they could hold back what came next. Then, barely above a whisper, it slipped out, the first word he'd ever heard from her lips. "Sorry." The room froze. Elijah stared, eyes wide. She blinked quickly, realizing what she'd done, as if the word had betrayed her. But he didn't shout, didn't question. He simply nodded, slow and gentle, his voice barely more than a breath. "You don't have to be afraid here." Elijah sat on the porch that night, staring out at the wet fields, her words still echoing in his mind. He didn't like noise. He didn't like me talking. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it, like it was normal, Like pain was something you wore like a coat and never thought to take off. His heart ached for her, not just as a child, but as someone who had been taught to disappear to survive. He thought of Ruth gone too soon and the quiet that had swallowed him after. Years of working the earth alone, speaking only to animals and wind. He told himself that silence was peace, but maybe it had just been easier than risking the hurt of needing someone again. Now here was this girl, carrying wounds no one could see, and somehow she had wandered into his life. And maybe, just maybe, he needed her as much as she needed him. Two souls bruised by different storms had found each other in the stillness, not to be fixed, but to be understood. He didn't know how to heal her, but he could sit with her in the quiet. He could show her she wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in years, Elijah felt something like hope settle in his chest, quiet, steady, and warm. Healing didn't come all at once. It came in moments, small and soft. Elijah started speaking more around her, narrating his tasks as if telling stories to the air. "Gotta turn the soil today, Lila," he'd say, glancing over. "Rain made it thick." At first she only nodded, then one day she replied, hesitant and quiet. "Okay, Papa." He stopped mid-step. "What did you call me?" Her face flushed, shy and unsure. "Papa," she whispered. He didn't say anything right away, just smiled, the kind that lived deep in the eyes, and gave a slow nod. From that day on they began teaching each other. Elijah showed her how to tend the garden rows, how to fix a fence with wire and patience. She listened, tried, failed, and tried again. And he never rushed her, never raised his voice. In return, Lila gave him back something he hadn't realized he missed: joy. She laughed, not often, not loudly, but when she did, it lit up the room like morning sun. She showed him how to dance with the chickens, how to whistle through grass, how to find pictures in clouds, and sometimes, when he'd mutter about aching knees or stubborn goats, she'd grin and say, "You're just old, Papa." He'd chuckle every time. The silence between them had once been heavy. Now it was comfortable, a place where trust grew. They didn't need to speak constantly. They simply understood each other. Two wounded hearts learning slowly to beat again. "You're now using our basic model. To access more intelligence, create an account or log in. Log in, sign up for free." After that day, something shifted. She didn't run or retreat. Instead, she sat closer at meals. She watched Elijah's face when he spoke, and once, just once, she whispered back a quiet, "Thank you," when he handed her a slice of bread. Days passed. Her voice came in pieces, like old floorboards creaking under new weight. One afternoon, while the rain returned, she finally spoke more. "My name's Lila," she said, eyes down. Then, after a long pause, "I can hear." Elijah didn't flinch, just kept shelling peas, waiting. "My daddy." "He didn't like noise," she whispered. "Didn't like me talking." Her hands twisted in her lap. "Said I was stupid, loud, useless." She took a shaky breath. "When I was quiet, he left me alone. When I stopped talking, he stopped hitting." Her voice cracked. "I started pretending. If I was deaf, people didn't expect anything." Tears slipped down her cheeks. Not loud, not dramatic, just silent streaks of pain long held in. Elijah didn't speak right away. He set the bowl aside and gently reached across the table, resting his hand near hers, not grabbing, just offering. "You ain't useless," he said softly, "and you don't have to pretend here." Leela nodded slowly, her fingers brushing his, a quiet acceptance. She hadn't just been silent, she'd been hiding. Now, with each halting word, each tear, she was stepping into the "it was a simple accident." Elijah was washing a pot at the outdoor pump when it slipped from his wet hands and clanged against the stone step with a sharp, ringing crash. The girl had been sitting nearby, plucking leaves from a branch. When the pot struck the ground, she flinched, just slightly. A twitch in her shoulders, brief, almost nothing, but Elijah saw it. He froze, heart skipping. She didn't look up or speak. Her face remained unreadable. her fingers continuing their slow, aimless movements. But the tiny reaction, it echoed in Elijah's mind like the pan's crash still hung in the air. Could she hear? He didn't say anything, didn't want to scare her, didn't want to break whatever fragile trust had started to grow between them. But that night, as she slept curled beneath the quilt, Elijah sat nearby longer than usual, watching the quiet rise and fall of her breath. He began to wonder, had she heard everything all along? The clatter of pans, the wind through the corn stalks, even his voice. The thought left him unsettled, not in fear, but in possibility. She wasn't just a mystery anymore. She might be keeping a secret. The sun had just dipped behind the trees when the man reappeared, staggering, reeking of whiskey and desperation. Elijah was repairing the fence when he heard the slurred shout from the road. "That's my girl," the man bellowed, his bloodshot eyes wild. "I sold her, but it wasn't forever. She belongs to me." He stumbled forward, fists clenched, voice rising as he demanded more money. His threats hung heavy in the air like storm clouds, dark and looming. Lila froze beside Elijah, her body shrinking back, eyes wide with terror. Without hesitation, she slipped behind the farmer, pressing close as if he were a shield. Elijah stepped in front of her, voice steady but firm. "She's not yours to take, not anymore." The man sneered and took a step forward, but the farmer's unwavering gaze stopped him cold. The tension stretched taut until the drunk man, frustrated and desperate, spat curses and threats. Word spread quickly through the town, and for the first time, the people who once turned away gathered in quiet support. Neighbors who had seen the man's cruelty now stood behind Elijah. Their eyes held something fierce, a refusal to let fear and silence win anymore. The drunk father sneered, realizing the weight against him had shifted. Alone, angry, defeated, he stumbled back toward the road. Before he disappeared into the dusk, Elijah called out one last time, "This girl is safe now. You don't get to decide her fate." The man's threats faded with the sunset. For the first time in a long time, the farm felt like a sanctuary, not just for Elijah, but for Lila too. Months passed, and with them came change. Lila thrived. She read the worn books Elijah found at the market, tracing words with curious fingers. Her voice grew stronger, soft laughter spilling freely. She sang to the animals as she worked, filling the farm with new life. She helped Elijah tend the crops, hands steady and sure. No longer the silent shadow, she became his bright companion, calling him Papa with growing warmth. Elijah felt a new sense of purpose bloom inside him. The loneliness that had wrapped around his heart loosened like morning fog. The past wasn't forgotten. It lingered like a scar, a reminder of pain and survival, but it no longer held them captive. Together they had carved out a new story, one of healing, hope, and the quiet power of kindness. Stories like Elijah and Lila's remind us that pain often hides behind silence, and healing begins with small acts of courage and kindness. They teach us to listen closely, to the unheard, the unseen, the overlooked. If this story touched you, share it. Look out for those who feel invisible. Stand with them. Because sometimes the greatest heroes aren't wearing capes or wielding swords.